Good afternoon and welcome to the Gateways Music Festival 2020 Virtual Chamber Music Festival and to this very special event, our discussion on Black Lives Matter and classical music. Before I go any further, I'd like to make a land acknowledgement. I'm calling to you from what most people know as St. Paul, Minnesota, the west side of St. Paul in my case, but this is actually the land of the Sioux, more specifically the land of the Wapakute of the Eastern Dakota. As Black people strive toward a more equitable society for ourselves on this stolen land, I think it's important to also acknowledge the people from whom that land was stolen. So if you'd like to learn more about land acknowledgements and about whose land you live on, visit native-land.ca. That's native-land.ca. My name is Garrett McQueen. I am a bassoonist with the Gateways Music Festival Orchestra and with many other ensembles. I'm a content creator, the executive producer and director of Triloquy, and I'm the host and producer of Gateways Radio. I really want to thank everyone who's joined me so far this week for that very special broadcast. It's an honor to shine a light on the many Gateways musicians who make all of this possible. So bravo to everyone. Bravi tutti. If you are new to the Gateways Music Festival this year, welcome. Gateways is the unique vision of award-winning concert pianist Arminta Hummings Dumasani, who founded Gateways in Winston-Salem, North Carolina back in 1993. The festival, whose mission is to connect and support professional classical musicians of African descent and enlighten and inspire communities through the power of performance, festival over the years. The live 6-day festival has attracted more than 125 musicians, and it's drawn a combined audience of more than 7,000. Now, this festival, like most everything else this year, looks a little different. We were all definitely very disappointed to not be able to convene in fellowship in person, but we're all still very excited that this virtual format has and will allow folks from across the country and from around the world to join us in celebration of the unique intersection of Blackness and classical music. This year's virtual festival began on Monday, November 9th, and will conclude on Friday, November 13th. Festival activities include 10 public events, a public school student residency, a 5-hour block curated performances from past festivals hosted by yours truly, and lots more. You can find more details and everything you need over at gatewaysmusicfestival.org. Before I get today's panel discussion going, I'd like to thank all of our individual and institutional supporters, with special recognition to the Eastman School of Music, the University of Rochester, the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York State Council on the Arts, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Ford Foundation. I'd also like to thank WXXI, Rochester's public radio and television station, for their media sponsorship. Huge shout out to Kirsten Piper Brown, Julia Figueres, and everyone over at WXXI. You can join all of our supporters as well. I hope you'll go over to the Gateways website, click donate, and make your contribution. Something that I've always attributed to one of my many life-changing conversations with Lee Kuntz is the idea that we as Black people can really pull something out of what seems like nothing sometimes. So what if we could pull something out of what was actually a lot, all of your support? So please be sure to head over and make your contribution to the Gateways Music Festival. No amount is too small or too large. So as I mentioned, this is a very special panel on classical music and Black Lives Matter. I have the pleasure of being joined by 3 very distinguished musicians in the field: Miss Hobson Pilot, retired principal harp of the Boston Symphony; Lady Jess, the genre-bending violinist who slays from Bach to Beyonce; and Mr. Titus Underwood, public speaker and principal oboe of the Nashville Symphony Orchestra, the very first Black person to hold that position. I want to offer a little time for each of the panelists to about themselves, to offer what they hope for people to take away from today's conversation. I'd like to start with you, Ms. Hobson Pilot.
Well, Black Lives Matter has not been spoken about a lot in classical music, especially back when I started out. I began my career with the Washington National Symphony in 1966. So a lot was going on as far as civil rights was concerned back then. But there certainly this is now how many years from 1966 to now, there certainly has not been a lot of progress as far as classical music is concerned in integrating the orchestras. And that, for me personally, has been very disappointing.
As pilot, I also understand that there's some storms in your neck of the woods. Are you okay? Is everything safe where you are?
Well, so far so good. It's a Hurricane Eta, I guess they call it, and we don't have many hurricanes on the west coast of Florida, which is where we are, just between Tampa and Fort Myers. But this one got us, and right in the middle of a panel discussion.
Well, we're keeping you. Thanks so much for being here. Lady Jess, how about you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you hope for people to take away from this discussion? Oh, it looks like you're muted again. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Oh, there you are.
No, good. Also, I'm going to kind of speak deliberately because I don't know if it's delayed there. We have terrible weather here, so it's kind of affecting the internet. But for me personally, I'm someone who has been kind of both in the scenes and behind the scenes and has lived through what feels like every kind of microaggression possible before it was okay to speak about those things. And so I've been an odd man out until very recently. And so I think everything that I'm passionate about, I've been very clear about. But now that we're in this new normal, as it were, which is a phrase I hate, but now that we're here, my concern is with the allyship and whether or not it sticks so that I know if I need to move on. There isn't really, I kind of hold a unique position because there isn't really anything keeping me in any one place other than where the work is. And I both have to participate in the work and also kind of create it. And this is just a new frontier and a new opportunity. And I'm both disgusted with where we are and invigorated. So to answer as honestly as possible, I'd say like I'm at the intersection of both of those things, and this feels like a really intense let's see what happens time that we're in. This can either be really huge and like rip, or the band-aid can rip off and we cut off the leg. That's how I feel. Yeah, that's kind of the best way to describe where I am.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that. We're definitely looking forward to your unapologetically honest takes on things. And finally, Titus, yourself and what are people to take away from this discussion?
Well, I'm Titus Underwood, principal of the Nashville Symphony, like you said, and speaking a lot of things, create content, all this stuff. The one thing I want people to take away from it is one, I want it to be anchored in the specificity of Black people, and I always say that doesn't mean that I'm not in solidarity with other groups that are marginalized, but a lot of times within language of people of color or diversity or whatever, Black people, we're put on the sidelines a lot of the times, but we're the people who bear the cost of that a lot, or our bodies are the ones that create the momentum for the movement, for other things to be introduced within that without ours being specifically addressed. And I would like to see, the biggest thing I would like to see is not just lip service, but tangible resolutions. How can we come up with tangible things, not necessarily more committees and conversations, but contracts and CBAs being changed and unions being reformed and people being elected in places to get into not just the exciting work, the boring work that makes it stick. So that's the thing that I want to primarily talk about is there's a reason why things stay the same is because that is in best interest of contract protections and we are they are them and whatever the union, all of us are that. So in order for us to change that, then we have to get into the language to make sure that these things actually happen.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you mentioned unions because I have a union specific question I'm going to throw at you a little later in this
Okay.
conversation. But thank you to everyone. So if you go over to the Gateways website, you'll find a section on Black Lives Matter and how Gateways has responded to the movement. So I want to read a little of that statement for everyone to help us frame today's panel. It says, Gateways Music Festival mourns the lives of the unarmed men, women, and young people of African descent who have lost their lives at the hands of police. Similarly, we mourn the generations of our ancestors who have experienced similar tragic fates over the last 400 plus years while living in a state of government-sanctioned terror. As an organization dedicated to supporting the artistry of professional classical musicians of African descent for nearly 30 years, Gateways fully supports the Black Lives Matter movement and stands with all people who reject anti-Black racism in all of its ugly and insidious forms. So to further frame this conversation, I'll read from the website of the Black Lives Matter organization. Hashtag Matter was founded in 2013 in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer. Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation Incorporated is a global organization in the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada whose mission is to eradicate white supremacy and to build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and by vigilantes. By combating and countering acts of violence, creating space for Black imagination and innovation, and centering Black joy, we are winning immediate improvements in our lives. So, Anne, I want to start off our conversation by going to you. It's unfortunate that lots of people see this as a time of a beginning when it comes to the discourse surrounding race. You know, Black Lives Matter, as I read there, was formed in response to Trayvon Martin's murder, but the problem of police brutality is much older than that. From your perspective, how has classical music's relationships evolved over the generations, over the decades, when it comes to, again, that relationship between classical music and police brutality, or the broader conversation of anti-racism?
Well, when I joined the Boston Symphony in 1969, I was the only Black player in the orchestra then. And when I retired from the Boston Symphony in 2009, and I was the only black player in the BSO for 20 years. And then 20 years later, Owen Young, a wonderful cellist, African-American cellist, joined the orchestra. And when I retired from the Boston Symphony in 2009, he became the only Black player. So, and you look around the other orchestras, especially the larger ones, what they call the major orchestras. I don't keep up that much anymore, but very few have more than two people of color in the orchestra. It was interesting back when I did audition for the BSO in 1969. It was just the beginning of what they call auditioning behind a screen. That occurred because two Black players that auditioned for the New York Philharmonic and did not get the job sued Leonard Bernstein and the New York Philharmonic. So to try to make things appear anyway more fair and equitable, they started this auditioning behind a screen. When I auditioned for the BSO, I was told not to wear high heels because they didn't want to identify by gender, and the screen was there and all the panel and was behind the screen, so they couldn't see you, they couldn't discriminate against you for race or sex or whatever, age even. But that in itself has not helped with jobs for people of color. What it has helped with is for women. When I was in the BSO, when I joined in 1969, there were 4 women in the orchestra. And now I think there's more than 40. So it did help women get jobs, but not people of color. I think there's a lot of reasons why that is the case, one being economic. And that's an interesting conversation to have. Now, a lot of people are calling for the screen to be taken down because, I guess the point is, if you're looking for, or say you're looking for people of color to join the orchestra, the screen prohibits you from leaning toward that more than not. And again, that's an interesting conversation to have, whether the screen should be taken down or not. I don't have the answer, but I have the question.
I'm among those who think it should be taken down, but that's for another panel, I suppose. But considering the small number of people we talk about as when it comes to impacting change, when it comes to the small number of other Black musicians that you had the opportunity to work with professionally, only one, as I'm hearing you say, how did that impact how certain conversations came into the concert hall? So, over your tenure with the Boston Symphony, there have been so many things. I'm thinking of the 1992 riots, the Rodney King riots, off the top of my head. How did those conversations enter the workplace, if they did at all, considering the small number of Black people in these orchestras, namely the ones that you've played with?
Right. Well, the orchestra that I played with, there weren't conversations at all about it. I can't remember one conversation about any of those things. And, what's going on now after I left, I do think it's easier for Black players in the orchestras to bring these things up now than it was, I was in Boston Symphony 40 years, so 43 years ago. It was difficult because even though there has not been much progress as far as hiring people of color, there has been progress about bringing these issues out so that people are more willing to speak about them now, I think, than they were back in 1966 when right at the time, around the time that Martin Luther King was killed and Malcolm X and all of those things were going on. So I think it is easier for Black players or people of color in the orchestras to speak about it now. At least I hope so.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jess, folks in your generation, our generation, musicians are doing more than just talking about it. We're taking the you have done in New York City. So, for many of us, it was Black Lives Matter in conjunction with social media that shined a light on the killing of Elijah McClain, a violinist who faced the horrors of police brutality. I want you to talk a little bit about the violent protests that you've participated in. So it's one thing to go outside in the spirit of Black Lives Matter with picket signs. You and countless others went out there with violins. Talk to me a little bit about that.
It's so interesting because when I first heard about that protest, it was actually a white colleague of mine, Adriana Malelo, who reached out to me and said, we're trying to organize a protest here in New York, and we're trying to do it so that people can play. And I was like, that's fantastic. But at that point, I was so fatigued by the entire exercise that the simple fact of her being like a white musician reaching out to me about this, my first reaction was, fine, organize it, show me, and I'll show up. And so as the days, led up to it, there were things that happened in the organization of that protest, including a white classical violinist tried to kind of take credit and take over and control the protest itself. And the more I heard about people like Adriana advocating for the original protest, which was organized by two Black violinists here in New York, Sean Bennett and Miles Gittins, organized that in-person, like, jam-loving protest in Washington Square Park. And so just literally having to be online and navigating a white violinist trying to hijack the damn protest got me fired up enough to really want to just come out and support. And, there were a lot of musicians in New York who, let's be honest, we're all sustaining a functional depression because we can't perform, especially in New York. So for all of the musicians to come out and play together. It was cathartic in multiple ways, but it was also just like, come on, man, like we have to reclaim the damn protest, like seriously. So when we actually did show up, the other protests had already happened. They had already tried to take all the social media credit, to do press conferences and media appearances. It was wild. And the allies, I really have to give credit to the allies here in New York. The white string players here in New York really came out and on social media and in person and were like, we're here to support the Black people who organized this protest. So if you want to come, you stand to the back, you stay supportive, and they did. And so it was honestly one of the most beautiful moments of the summer, because the city of New York showed out, the public showed out. There were some people there that were trying to interrupt some of the things, and there would be people in the crowd in true New York style that was like, nope, not having it today. Let these people play. So it was really beautiful. And with that said, it was also maddening because nothing has happened. You know, I mean, like, and if you follow Justice for Elijah McQueen on Instagram, which I highly suggest, you can stay up to date with all the updates. And, you know, it did pick up like a celebrity following. However, the most resounding thing that I've experienced in the days after that protest is the way that the small group of allies that were ready to roll from the beginning are still here, and everybody else has kind of like fallen off. And I understand that we're all experiencing election fatigue and pandemic fatigue and everything else, but the point of the protest is not to give you a kumbaya moment that ultimately changes nothing. The point is to incite change and to push legislation faster and to pressure the people in power who have the chance to actually like do something about it. And so they passed the ketamine law, which is great. But ultimately justice for Elijah himself has not been served. So I would say on the grand scale of things, I think the protest was a great example of where we are as a country. We're incited, we're ready to go, we're ready to be riled up, but there's a unification that needs to happen. And there's a lot of group trauma that we're dealing with, and amongst all of that, in order to really be unified in how unapologetic we are and how practical we are moving forward, as far as just like cutting through all of that. Like, I could care less about how you actually feel about my skin tone. I don't care. If you have some wrong idea about like the brain structure of Black people, whether or not we should be playing classical music, quite frankly, getting emotional about that is a waste of my time. The protest showed me that the concern needs to be so much of what Titus was talking about: restructuring, holding people accountable, restructuring, tearing things down, starting over again. And I personally needed to go to see that need, and to also at the same time feel the energy of this generation of freelancers, which is that something has to change. Because I was very apathetic and very just like, okay, I don't care. I don't have the energy. I don't. But yeah, that I say that's the best like summary of that whole thing that I can give.
And you know, there's stories that we can tell about each one of these murders, both this past year and throughout history. But one of the reasons why Elijah McClain's story sticks out to me, because I was on the internet and I saw a GIF of him playing his violin literally to kittens, and then afterwards, you know, goofing around and being silly. So, you know, that moment not only humanized him, but made it personal. You know, being classical musicians, Jessica, does not absolve us from the horrors of police brutality and white supremacy. What, in your opinion, what is the unique or the specific message that Black classical musicians should take from that moment, both his murder and the response to it?
I think that we need to, I feel like, and I stutter, I stumble across this because this has evolved so much for me personally during the quarantine. But today, in this moment, I feel like the takeaway is to prioritize options for us. Cultural equity putting everything on the same page is not just like an activity. It's not a trend. We're doing that so that we are fiscally and in every other way on the same page. And I want Black classical musicians to know that there is no one answer. In this landscape, we have to be prepared for multiple scenarios, whether we like it or not. The pressure from when you and I and all of us were in school has shifted. You know, it's there. I just want people to know that you may not find the answer in an institution. That's fine. You may find the answer in an institution. That's fine. You may not find it in an orchestra. You might find it wherever you are. I just want us to be empowered enough to not fall prey to conditioning that will be divisive. Because all of that, like at this point, I feel like as Black people, we don't have the luxury to really separate the art from life or the art from politics. We just don't. We live that. At this point, this election has shown us that breathing is excellence. So with that said, I want us to be in a position where we are intellectually and strong enough, aware enough of our heritage to respect it, prioritize it, and use that to unify in a way that, regardless of how anyone feels, we're just going to push through. Because I really think that at this point, we don't even have the luxury to even discuss it in a way that's not, this is our only choice.
Right, absolutely. And Jess, you used a phrase, multiple scenarios, that actually serves as a segue, Titus, into what I wanted to ask you first. So, in that Black Lives Matter statement that I read earlier, there's a phrase in there, countering acts of violence. So, however we want to define violence, you have lots of experience in multiple scenarios, again, as Jess said, dealing with that in the workplace. What impact has that had on, what you want to see in the field, considering the fact that the workplace is shut down now? So, the things that you have dealt with are things that are gone simply because COVID has closed a lot of orchestras. What's your perspective on those experiences that you've had, and how are you using them moving forward, assuming that the orchestras do open back up?
I mean, moving forward, I think if I'm going into like super, things get. I'll tell you, things get confusing at times. I think I think the thing that I do not see within orchestras in general are things that are put within contracts that are behavioral things that should not happen. There are things that continue to happen within orchestras. Everyone has those stories when they talk about whether the teacher lost it or the principal this lost or this section member did this crazy thing and they're still on the job 10 years later. Like that makes absolutely no sense. I mean, if you were working for like a corporate company, Amazon or something, you would have been out of there a long time ago. I understand that it's kind of like one of those things that we have to really look at ourselves as far as how we build unions. It's not just there it's there to protect us. And it also, who protects musicians from musicians, I always ask. Like, who's there to say that this person is harming me? And I understand people can get petty and stuff like that. But if there's ample evidence of someone doing something that's wrong, it shouldn't be an advantage of the union to further protect the person who's harming another person. That should never be, in any instance, in any case. So like everyone knows who is, like when people talk about police brutality, they say the good cops know who the bad cops are. But a lot of people are scared that, there are people who have agendas who want to bust their union wide open. And there are other people who sit there and watch things happen and don't say anything because maybe that bad cop has more power than the ones who actually went there to do something just to have the job. So within orchestras, there becomes like this group mentality that happens that if anyone says anything, it's going to be us against them. It's going to be management against the musicians. It's like this. There's the evil empire, then there's us. I said there aren't any evil empires. There are people who have bad agendas in both parts. So it isn't necessarily that it's all rotten or one side is all rotten. It's just that there needs to be things and measures that are put within the language to make sure that these things don't persist or can actually happen at all to anyone. So that's the hard part. But the other thing we was talking about hiring and jobs. The biggest thing I've been talking about is there should be, when people talk about quote unquote diverse or black players, right? I'm going to speak about black players specifically. if an orchestra is looking for a cultural change to happen in their institution as it pertains to Black people, you need to have enough people from that cultural group to have diversity of thought present. You need to have enough people there that the best solutions are crystallized amongst many minds. Not just, hey, Titus, what is the solution for Black people? I don't know all the answers. That's why I call friends. That's why I have come from a community of people. That's how cultures become a thing. It's because it comes from many brilliant minds coming up with things and experiences and outlooks, So I can't have the whole myriad of answers. However, but if you have enough people there, then they actually bring their culture. If there are a group of people there, then a group phenomenon starts to happen, right? So if I'm there and we're saying that we're dealing with anti-racism, but you have people that are thinking a certain way within other cultures, then that can be the inverse can happen, right? So I think that the hardest thing for people to deal with is to deal with the specificity of Black players without saying that we need to talk about other issues. The problem I have is that people would use that and say, we need to change the audition system in general. So how does that affect Black players specifically? I'm not saying everybody. I'm saying when you said Black Lives Matter, I want to hold you on the word Black. I want to keep you there. And I want to deal with that issue. Because then we have to deal with other issues that have to do with the legacy of slavery here in this country that a lot of orchestras don't want to talk about. And they say, why does the past matter? I say, why does Beethoven matter? Why we live in a historical vacuum forever in which we program our seasons with things that are from the 1700s, basically barely into the 20th century. So, like, I want to know if that doesn't matter, if Beethoven's third doesn't matter, moving us into the Romantic period, does my people who was breaking soil, who built the capital for you to have your orchestra in the first place matter? So, I like having historical anchoring, even amongst my own people, to make sure that we're all educated and armed with what is this legacy in which we come from, because we'll always be confused if we don't understand the context of our own existence. We'll just be reacting to it instead of building things that put us in an advantage point where we can actually start building instead of just reacting to. So I am of the way of saying, how do I know how this thing works? How does the union work? How do these CBAs work? How do these committees work? How's stuff actually programmed? How's the patron model work? I want to know everything about it because I can learn something from that, right? So for me, learning from that, I have this experience and other lens on things that brings value to it, but I also know the current system which I work in, right? So I know what are the ways that it can actually change instead of me saying, oh, I want this, this, and this. I know exactly how that can change because people will come up and ask for change, but the actual personnel that's there or the people to carry it out are not necessarily there to carry out what you're demanding, or the contract can't even facilitate what you're demanding. So I can ask for something. It's like I can go scream and ask for, hey, I want finances to be put specifically within Black communities. And they say, well, it's not a law yet. And they can legit say that. So I want us to get not just into the things that get us charged, but into the things that's behind the scenes that's not as fancy, right? Staying consistent with it, knowing that the younger generations are watching us as well. Because I want to leave something better for them. Even though I'm principal oboe, doesn't mean that I'm not tethered to that group who people think as a bottom caste in America. It's inevitable I'm tired to that. That's why, when I was in New York City, that's the most police harassment I ever had. When I lived in New York, and I grew up in the South. So like, and I had problems in the South, I'll tell people I'm a 6'2" dark-skinned Black man. I've had run-ins and stuff like that, people thinking I'm somebody else. That's happened to me with an oboe on my back. So I just want, the thing I want us to really do is stay consistent. Stay really consistent and know that we come, even though we don't think similarly all the time, a lot of times the end result of what we want can be very in lockstep with one another. But we have to hash out those differences of how we get there. But do not, I always say, people say, well, that's why I don't like working with, people get on, Black folks get on my nerves sometimes. And it's like, okay, I get that. But at the same time, how many times has, a white institution screwed you over? You know what I'm saying? So like, come on, we in here fighting all these things. So lend a little bit more patience to one another. You know what I'm saying? People who are allies that are riders, really get up on this stuff so that you're not just in there for the emotional moment, but you also have context of why you're continuing to support Black people who are fighting for this cause. And also, Black people, be up on your stuff so you know the context of your own existence and how we won't be repeating this over again. So I want us to be really thorough with this, right? We need the thinkers, we need the doers, we need the visionaries, we need the boots on the ground. We need all of it. So that's where I'm at with this. And also, I love what Jess said. Is it actually going to happen within the orchestra? Like, I have to be cool if it. What if orchestras just say no? We don't want that, right? Then where am I? Where am I then? Right? It has to. If we want to push that envelope, then cool. But I'm also thinking about during this time, we have the advantage to have the internet to create any audience you want to create. If you want to play repertoire, play Black repertoire, order it and play it. Like, no one's stopping you. It's not that the music is dying, institutions are suffering, which means that people are going to go to the thing that is the most popular culture that catches their eye, which is primarily in America, Black culture. So what does that mean? You're actually in an advantage because institutions are quiet. Really think about what you can do and what you can create right now that actually puts you in an advantageous position. You can create whatever aesthetic you want. You can play whatever music you want. You can collaborate with any artist you want right now. Because all artists are suffering and dying to collaborate with someone. So that's where I'm at with this. Thinking about it not just institutionally, but how can we build things that we can fully function within our like a gateways, uplift gateways. You know, really say, you know what, I'm playing with gateway, I'm riding with this. You know, so those are the type of things that I really want to see us take pride in, and the things that we already have built and new things that we're building that let us fully function in our own aesthetics, and that way we can have real artistic freedom and have impact.
Yeah, and Ms. Pilot, before I pass it back to you, Titus, you've mentioned unions a few times now, so I kind of want to speak specifically. You know, here in the States and in Canada, there's the American Federation of Musicians, which, you know, on paper, I've never had something in which I've needed them in my performance career, but on paper, you know, they are supposed to be a musician's protection. Can you name the American Federations of Musicians as an anti-racist institution? Are they an institution that Black classical musicians should look to for protections in the workplace?
The hard questions. You getting in there, Garrett. You getting in there. Should we look to the union as something? I've been having this conversation with a few of my friends. The union has chairs that can be elected, right? Why won't we find people and start having us show up to these elections where like two people show up and be like, you're the person who's going to run our union? The union is just a vessel, right? The union is just the vessel. If I bring 15 of my homies, whoever it is who's in the AFM, and say, you know what, I'm running for such and such chair. You can take a chair of somebody who's been there for 30 years. Like, really, we can create our own things and use that vessel to implement the things that we want to be there. I mean, there was Black unions as well before. I mean, and the unions was historically used to push Black people out, especially in the auto industry up in the Midwest. You wonder why you have some of the harshest Black neighborhoods in the Midwest. There's a reason why that exists. A lot of Black people pushed out of there. At this point, is this something that's speaking on behalf of Black people specifically? I have to say no. Is it super involved in the movement of people progressively amongst Black people? I have to say no. Unless I see some real work, and here's the thing, the orchestras and unions are made up of musicians. It's not like this entity in and of itself. Like, I have to pay my dues, just comes out of my check, to the union. So we are they. So unless I'm addressing musicians specifically, then I'm not even talking to the union. And that's why I say when we're talking about institutions, it's not some abstract thing. It's like the institutions are made up of people. So when orchestras say there are less Black people in orchestras, musicians pick musicians. And I want us to really let that stick. So it isn't about you being politically Democrat or whatever the case may be, a political or advanced in your thinking in some other part of society. It's about how do you view classical music and should I be there? And that's how I mainly look at it. So at this point, I have to say no, but can it change? Yes.
So, Ms. Pilot, With that in mind, Titus is speaking to, the inability for orchestral structures like unions to really protect Black people in those spaces. I want to go even before you joined the Boston Symphony Orchestra. In your first day or first weeks with the National Philharmonic, did you feel a sense of protection? Did you feel a sense of danger? Could you paint that picture for us?
I definitely did not feel a sense of protection at all, but just going back even further, before I joined the Washington National Symphony in '66, when I was still a student at the Philadelphia Musical Academy, I was asked to play for some entertainers at the Latin Casino in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. That was probably 1964 or 63. But they said, you're going to have to join the union in order to play there because it's a union job. So I went to the union where they told me to go and found out that they said to me, well, this is the white. You need to go to the Black union to join because the unions were segregated at that time. So, I had a long discussion with the people that wanted to hire me. They could not keep me from joining the white union at that time. And it didn't, they said the problem with joining the Black union at that time was that you may not be able to get the jobs that you could, for example, the Latin Casino job. So I ended up joining, and they also said it was very important that the unions are going to be merging soon. So I ended up joining the union, which eventually merged. But yeah, back then, there was a Black union and there was a white union. Maybe the Black union protected the players a little better, the Black players, than the white union. I don't know. But I've never had a sense that any union would protect me from anything. I will say also that I was really not the first Black player in the BSO. There was another Black player who joined, a bass player, Ortez Walton, who joined the Boston Symphony in the late 50s. But he didn't last long. When I met my husband shortly after that, he was a good friend of Ortez's. And I found out that the reason Ortez did not last long was because he had several terrible confrontations with, obviously the rest of the orchestra was all white. So he had several confrontations with some of the players who made denigrating statements to him and racist remarks. And Ortez had a temper and ended up in several fistfights with some of these players and was let go. So no, I'm sure he didn't even think to go to the union about that. I don't know for a fact, but so I think back then it was difficult. As a woman, when I joined the symphony in Washington and then Boston, I wasn't going to have a fist fight with anybody because, well, obviously I would have lost that. Yeah. Yeah. So I also felt as if I didn't have necessarily, if anything happened, I didn't necessarily have the protection of my colleagues. Obviously, some of them I would have, my friends that were there, but not all of them. Can I just ask, Titus, are there other Black players in Nashville?
No, I'm the only Black player in the symphony at the moment.
And Ortez Walton, who you brought up, he didn't last very long in Boston, but you did. A career that lasts longer than most. I don't necessarily want to ask you about some of your interactions with fellow musicians, problematic over the years, as much as I'm curious about what kept you there. What was your driving force to really stay on that stage and behind that harp, despite the vitriol you may have gotten in between?
Well, when I joined the symphony, I was hired as an assistant principal harp, and then when the principal harpist retired in 2000, then I became the principal harp. And it's one of the best jobs in the world, so there was no reason for me to want to leave. And I just went in every day and tried to play my best. And I never had any problems in that sense. You know, all the conductors were complimentary, and some of the comments were basically out of ignorance, is the way I looked at it. And so I just tried to let them roll off my back. If something was very upsetting, like, for example, one person around me did use the N-word, and I had to say to him, "Don't you ever use that word around me again." And if he apologized, his first comment was, "Well, Richard Pryor says that all the time." And I said, "Well, I'm not Richard Pryor, though." So,
And
you know,
neither.
yeah, there were times when I had to let people know that what they were saying was upsetting, but the 40 years went by pretty quickly, actually.
Oh, well, Jess, we center so many of these conversations around the orchestra, around that sort of workplace. But, as you know, as we all know, there are so many other corners of this field. What are we missing by centering conversations concerning Black Lives Matter and classical music in the concert hall? What perspectives are we missing? What unique perspectives do you have as someone who doesn't have a seat in an orchestra?
It's interesting for me because for so long playing in an orchestra was my goal. Like it has been since I first sat down in youth orchestra. And I'm good at it. I enjoy it. I love it. I hate having to make this stupid choice. But my experience with orchestras and with unions as a contractor, as a woman of color who looks younger than I am, my experience with the union has been nothing short of a nightmare. It's an organized, corrupt system, and it helps no one of color unless you are locked into that system through specific gigs, especially in New York, through Broadway, through TV. But even with TV, we're not protected. You're not protected as a musician even before you get to the part where you're Black or a woman. And so if you add on to that being a contractor, as a Black contractor, as a woman, all of the grief, all of the money lost, all of the stress, 92 to 3% of that has been in dealing with the union. And Titus is exactly right. The union is made up of your colleagues. So it's like, who's protecting us from us? No one. And I think, that always will spill over into mainstream work. Because as a contractor, I'm always going to be in the middle of the thing. I'm working with the artist who needs the players, and I'm working with the players who may or may not be used to the mainstream world and how that works. I tell people all of the time the best job I have ever had in my life, the best paying job, the most well-protected job, the most cushioned job, the job that has taken me literally around the globe was proudly not union. And I don't know if anybody knows, I was at Sphinx a few years ago, and my violin was left on a bus, like pulled away. And my boss insured my instrument for 30 grand to get it across the country, 2-hour rehearsal. Union did not do that. Did absolutely not do that. There have been times when I've gone to the union and said, look, I hired 12 union players to complete this gig for this mainstream artist. And this artist did not offer this gig as a union gig, but it's been a year and a half and we still haven't been paid. Can you help us? And they looked me in my face and said, no, union not here for you. That's also why I'm so big on options. And so being in the middle of that, I want classical musicians to understand that you need to know what else is there. You have to know, because the mainstream world is about what's happening right now. And if you want your art to matter, you need to make your art accessible. Black people need to know that Black classical music is accessible to them. Black people need to know that they already like it. They don't even know they like, that is, I think, the biggest draw for me. And with all of that said, because I center my life around options, I do seek out opportunities to play in orchestras. I love that. I was a stiletto for 4 summers. I played with the Charlotte Symphony for a few years. I toured with Max Richter. Like, I've done that because I love that. However, classical music has hurt me the most. So having that option, being able to pick and choose, I think that's the biggest draw. And that's why I do push genreless so much, because I want to love it all. And if I stay in one, I'm not going to, like, I'm not going to love it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Titus, Jess just sort of spoke to the idea that, Black people love this art form already and might not necessarily know it or understand it. With that being said, the concert hall audience still looks mostly white, as I'm sure you can speak to. I'll speak for myself. I won't speak for anyone else. I'm not sure that I'm going to go spend $50 or $60 or $70 to go hear a Beethoven symphony ever again in my life. I'm just not sure if that's something that I'm interested in. So with that in mind, with someone in a position like yours, what do you think are the tools of getting more of us back into the concert hall? Convince me that I do need to go hear you play the solos in Beethoven 3.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know if this is where I put it. Like, I don't know if. And look, I love playing in orchestra. I've dreamt of playing in orchestras, but I realize I know what the business is, right? Um, I don't know if you have to come hear me play Beethoven 3 if you don't want to. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know if you need to show up. But the one thing I have to say is that melanin on stage or Black people on stage don't mean anything without any cultural representation. Like, me just being there doesn't mean anything without me not being able to bring my culture. So I need to actually be able to bring my culture. Why aren't any people from the canon in which I come from? Why isn't Florence Price been programmed regularly? Why isn't William Grant Still Gershwin's been played all the time? That doesn't make any sense. Like, it's been documented that Gershwin hung out in Harlem all the time during the Harlem Renaissance to get those sounds. And William Grant Still had to arrange for Broadway for a lot of these guys to get to borrow his sound. So, like, you need to go to the source. So why isn't if I'm representing, if I'm telling a little Black girl that Margaret Bonds wrote music and I didn't tell her that, like, there's all these, white guys that wrote it. And here's the funny thing I think about classical music that cracks me up. It's like the ownership of music in the first place. It's like, how many people that identify as, like, if I say I'm white American, is Brahms my ancestor? Like, really think about that. Florence Price, I can legit say, is come from my specific background, or William Grant Still. I can literally say that. But can you say that, like, Shostakovich is your people? But you white American, no. That doesn't make any sense. So, like, this cultural affirmation that's happening is actually shallow and not grounded in any real truth. So if we're saying we're an American orchestra, I always tell people, I anchor them on this. Are we a European approximate or are we an American orchestra? Which is it? What is our cultural export, right? And the thing is about the culture, the major cultural export of America is what? Black music. And the things about the sounds that are in a Florence Price, within the William Grant Still, within the Bonds, it's rooted within that, what I call Black sacred music. I say that music's sacred. I don't say it's commercial. It's that our popular music is so addictive to people that it has to become popular. It's that good. So if in fact we have composers that write within this canon, why aren't we using that as an export? Then you will have to go to the people to actually interpret that music come from that experience. You would need the personnel also there. So that's the thing that happens, is that we're not in a society where it's full of, like, people who identify as European. It's full of what we call white people identify as white who have been consuming Black culture in their headphones. They don't have, like, the NBC orchestra up, so things have shifted.
So what is your response? If we want to frame this around an American export, fine. The Nashville Symphony comes back with an overture by Jennifer Higdon, a piano concerto by McDowell, and the Third Symphony of Copeland. Okay, we're there. Yeah. We're American. What's the response? How do you still vibe specifically for Blackness on stage?
I think the scope, if I'm talking about even, and that's why I said we need to be anchored in this. If you're talking about the descendants of slaves who built the American which we're on, you're going to be talking about Black people, the people who did the labor to build the American which people immigrated to, and which these people's lineage immigrated to, right? There had to be America to come to. So we're talking about America. I mean, my people been here at least 10 generations in this land. I'm, I mean, how American can that get? So I understand that, like, I am a black person, but if we're talking about the full scope of American music, you cannot do that in absence of black music. That's literally impossible. That means you have to be purposely doing that to cover up some sort of insecurity or something that should not be there in the first place. So I think that if we're going to deal with the cultural richness of America, and we're going to actually be something that puts out and export, it has to be rooted into a large extent within black culture, because that is the music that drives American culture. So I have to say that, like, yeah, you can. I'm not saying I'm going to take that Higdon can't be played or Beethoven can't be played. I'm not saying that, and I also don't want to play the music, but I also realize that we have a huge, rich canon that has not been tapped into that will actually even fiscally help your orchestra. So that's what I'm saying. Like, do we have to play these quote unquote Tchaikovsky fours? Do people even know what that is anymore? Like, really think about it. Does your average person in Nashville or in St. Paul really know Tchaikovsky's fourth? Or do just the music nerds know? Like, really think about that. So people only know what you show them. And if you celebrate it and promote it in the right in the right place, in the right way, people will flock to things that they like. That's how those pieces got popular in the first place. We've been playing the best music of Tchaikovsky and all this. We don't play Tchaikovsky's third. You know why? Because nobody really likes it that much. But you play 4, 5, and 6. So I want you to find the best pieces of black composers and give those maximum exposure instead of taking the worst pieces of black composers, because every composer has their worst works, and giving those maximum exposure and say, this is why we don't play that. William Grant still wrote over 300 pieces. Get out of here with that. There's plenty of stuff you can pick from. So, and if institutions don't want to play it, black people, what are we going to do about that? How do you form your own thing to give your own uplift to bring the demand your way? Because COVID has been the great equalizer in a lot of ways. Think of innovative ways in which you can bring the demand to yourself.
Ms. Pilot, you know, when we talk about cultural representation, I will never forget the first time that I played a piece of orchestral music by a black composer. I was all the way grown. I had gone through music school without having hearing about it, and I had won a job. So it just was not a part of my development. It's not part of the teaching, and for so many orchestras, it's not a part of the programming. Can you think back to times in which you felt culturally represented? When was the first time you performed an orchestral piece by a black composer in your tenure in the field?
Well, I remember a work by Ollie Wilson, by a few other composers, but what really impressed me was chamber players in 1980, I believe it was, or no, well, I'm not sure if it was not in 1980 or 2000, but that's an all-black chamber music group, of course, which therefore focuses on black music. And we played, you know, sometimes it's difficult to find music by black composers that feature the harp or that have a harp part in it. A lot of composers didn't write for the harp, but there's this wonderful piece by William Grant Still called Ananga. I recorded that and we performed it a lot. And so there are quite a few wonderful works, George Walker, that this group plays. So that's when I became more familiar with music of black composers, not certainly with the BSO. I don't know if Titus agrees. I think that some orchestras are seeing the light about this, because I see programs now are including a work or two of black composers. Then, of course, COVID hit and everything was shut down, so they're not being performed after all. But I think the League of American Orchestras has put a focus on diversity, both for the players and for the composers. And so I think orchestras are becoming more aware, which is great if that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And that piece by William Grant Still and your recording of it is one that I've shared with millions of listeners now. So thank you so much for creating that. It's really incredible. Jess, again, when we talk about centering the orchestra, we also have to talk about the dollars and cents of it all. You don't have the formal pay structure to benefit from, even outside of COVID. I wonder if you could speak to those unique challenges as it applies to race. I'm a very proud patron of yours on your Patreon, but there's a lot more that it takes to pay the rent every month, to eat. Can you speak to those challenges and how we can traverse those, or at least be more aware of what those challenges are?
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite honestly still trying to figure that out, because when COVID happened, well, I've never in my adult life had a back or like a teammate to share anything. So when COVID first happened, the feeling of it was a little bit delayed for me, because I was like, well, this is just another little thing. I'll just pivot this way and figure it out, because I'm used to having to figure it out. But it took on a whole other situation as I had to move in the middle of COVID. So, like, I mean, you guys don't need to know the detail, but basically, like, it was interesting because as a freelancer, it was like freelancing on steroids, honestly. And if you don't have a structure, or if you don't have insurance, if you don't have a company saying, okay, here's what we're going to do, we have a plan, or we're going to try, or even just to like try something new, then you had to be really innovative. And overnight, because as a freelancer, I'd spent so much time building up my own practice between LA and New York. And, I deal a lot with people who don't quite understand how you can be at the top of a classical freelance game and also do the mainstreams. Like, it's in that most of the time I'm like, I'm only doing all this because financially I've done what I've had to do. But it's really what I've noticed, as someone who's always had to do that and had to amp it up, is that it requires a level of research and preparation that this generation may not be so naturally inclined to. I mean, it's just social pattern. It's just where we are as a culture. We're very quick.
And that many Black people weren't prepared for, quite frankly, right?
Right. That we weren't prepared for. And so during this time, I got a financial planner for the first time in my life, and I had help for the first time in my life. And so it almost became like obsessive. I wanted to just call every young person, every young musician of color around me and be like, what other income streams do you have going? Are you aware of pop culture and where it's going? Do you understand what marketing is? Do you understand that I am someone who's been in this business for I've been working since I was 15, and for the first time, my entire practice came down to Patreon. Overnight, just boom, done. So what land do we own? What are we doing as Black people to be incredibly self-sufficient? Because I would love for us to not need them. The last conversation I had that was heated with our union was between me and a white male contractor who had been in the business for a long time, who simply couldn't wrap his mind around my presence as a contractor. And what I said to them in that call was, I don't need you. The time is over. We don't need you. Black people have enough popular traction and trend enough to transfer that to a fiscal area. And what I wanted to say earlier, and I forgot to say, is that so much of what I do stems from the fact that classism is the overriding factor with classical music. You can go to any white person, any white classical artist, and you can go to any Black classical artist, and so many of the arguments will line up and be the same, centered around classism. We have to know ourselves that what we're offering deserves equity before we can get that equity. And until we establish that equity in a financial way, And for me, that's at the center of it now. Like, I'm doing stuff like, what's the coin? I don't care. What's the coin? How can I further, you know? Then a lot of it's, I feel like, a waste of time. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean. But before
Well,
I feel,
I'm
go ahead.
switch to my computer. I'm sorry.
Okay,
I'm at,
do we still? Oh, okay, I have you there.
yeah, I'm here.
But before I wanted to open up the floor and field some questions from those of you watching and listening, I wanted to how can I say, just fast forward all the way to today and really speak to the now. Miss Pilot, I mean, I'm sure like everyone else, you were horrified by hearing the news of George Floyd here in the Twin Cities, where I live, and then of course all of the uprisings that were born from it. From your perspective, and again, even as someone who is retired from the field, do you think Black classical musicians have a unique responsibility in those protests? I mean, maybe even the uprisings. I don't know. From your perspective, what should be the Black classical musicians' response to things like that in light of large scale response?
Well, it still just is so shocking that it continues to happen. You know, think about it, George Floyd. He said, "Well, that's it. Police will be more careful now. They won't be killing Black men and women," and yet it continues to happen. So at first, I don't think that it even occurred to me that there was a responsibility of Black players. But now that it continues to happen, and and nothing seems to be done. And also, there are no concerts to play. I think Black players should revisit that option because it certainly would be a wonderful showing of solidarity if they did come out and play.
Titus, something that orchestras do all the time are those, community engagement events where the orchestra is set up and somewhere outside of the concert hall. But there's still that transactional relationship there. You know, they are requiring people in the community to do something to engage them. You know, it's not just one way how it could be. I've often thrown out the idea of pay an orchestra their rate or per service whatever to go pick up trash, to go clean up this neighborhood. Do you think it's fair to imagine a world in which orchestra members do more professionally under the umbrella of their institutions than just play their instruments? Would you be offended if you got an email that said the Nashville Symphony musicians are going to go to East Nashville and protest this or clean up this? Is that something that you think is viable?
I think, I mean, the one thing I want to think, I mean, it depends on how the orchestra is structured, right? So, like, you have boards, you have donors and all this stuff, and the interest of it being very patron centered, right? So, like, anything that comes down as far as the institution is concerned has to have all these branches and parties agree on it. Would I be opposed to an orchestra doing things outside of playing on the stage? No, I wouldn't be opposed to it. I mean, I think the short answer to that, I mean, the thing is that although I push for orchestras to change, right? And orchestras have been dragging their feet in a lot of ways. There's some that are more progressive than others, some that are following the blueprint of others that are more progressive. The biggest thing is it should we just be centering the orchestra at something? No, should it be upon Black players to just center the orchestra? I say that, do I love playing in the orchestra job? Yeah, it's great. I do love playing the music and stuff, but as far as the future is concerned for Black classical musicians, is it just in the orchestra? Should I spend all my time there? I don't know if it's just there. Only, I mean, time will tell. But can I see orchestras doing different things? Here's the thing I want to think about is, you know, an orchestra is like turning a Titanic in a swimming pool, like to get it to change. Or I can go straight to the source of people. I can say, "Yo, Garrett, what you want to do? Some Jessica, you want to do something?" And let's put together 30 players. It'll get done a lot faster, way faster. You'll be able to do whatever you want to do without any opposing anything. So I think the only thing we'd be hashing out is how do we actually do the goal in which all of us are going towards, the vision that we have. So I don't necessarily know that I want to keep knocking on that same door. Do I want to see change there? Of course I do. But if I want to see things done in a more without someone else setting my timetable in which things should progress, then I need to be going to the groups of people who are actually having this discussion. So I don't need to be like, oh, this is where we go. Like we're already having discussion. We've all had experiences. I mean, Miss Pilot's talking about in the '60s, and we're talking about the same stuff. Like this is so. Is the orchestra necessarily the place that we should be centering all the time? Or should we be building other institutions and things and say, you know what? You have all these fellowship programs, right? Orchestras. Okay, philanthropists. Go straight to the Council of Skins, Gateways, all these organizations that already exist already, and put that philanthropic money there. Put that money there. And you can just start off running immediately. You don't have to start a apprenticeship program or nothing like that. Give it directly to the people you're talking about benefiting and see what they would do and see what vision comes out of that and see what institutions and structures we can build that are way new and cool and all this stuff in the studies that we want to do. So I don't necessarily know if I just want to center the institutions that are already there. Do I want to see it change? Yes. But do I think the philanthropic money should be moving towards organizations that have been doing this for at least 50 years? Yes. Go straight to the source now. That's what I'm thinking.
Absolutely.
100%.
Absolutely. I want to remind everyone that if you have any questions or comments, please utilize the chat box on the right side of your screen. Jess, when we talk about, Titus described an orchestra as a Titanic, this big, unagile sort of behemoth. When we talk about, when there were conversations about police reform, certainly here in the Twin Cities following the murder of George Floyd, my instant reaction was, well, police reform, that word reform doesn't sound like enough for me, because what if we had said plantation reform? Is the plantation a place that needed to be reformed or one that needed to be destroyed? Okay. The police department, certainly the third precinct here that still lays bare and in ashes, was for so many an embodiment, a representation, a physical representation of oppression. How far down the list, if the police stations are on the top of the list as far as oppressive institutions that we need to go and burn down, how far down or how far up the list, in your opinion, are concert halls? Reforming the concert hall or dismantling the concert hall?
Oh, wait, am I on? Yes, I'm on. Okay. I switched devices, so I want to make sure I was on. I am a little bit ambivalent about this one because I have fatigue from teaching and talking to and working with and dealing with people in the community who I share a socioeconomic experience with, but not a musical one, who could quite honestly care less either way. Um, I I also struggle because the very premise of so many of these fellowships and pipelines into the orchestra is false. It's that we somehow need this help when the fact is we're a group of people. ADOS, if you're aware, I'd love to meet an orchestra who knew what American Daughters, what American Descendants of Slavery was. Like, start there.
I know,
But
Ada.
I know you know. So I don't know. It takes so much, to be really honest, it takes so much energy to actively care about what decision an orchestra is going to make next, that I find that I just want to put my energy towards moving forward, and more importantly, towards making sure that the younger generation understands how important it is for them to be even more informed than we are moving forward. The issue of whether or not the concert hall should be torn down is kind of like a non-issue to me.
Hmm.
I feel I feel that way about things like monuments to slavers. I feel that way, I don't feel that way about a building that houses a quite honestly dysfunctional orchestra with no real firm foundation in 2020. Um, I think that my question is to these orchestras, like, how anti-racist are you? Prove it. The onus is not on us. As far from where I sit, we hold the cards with our cultural currency. They can't ignore that. If they want to sell tickets, they have to embrace that. Otherwise, they have to accept the fact that tradition doesn't hold the same weight anymore. Tradition is no longer the functioning standard. The standard is what makes money. The standard is what ensures that these orchestras and that have been programming the same thing and hiring the same people and using the same hiring practices that everybody knows don't work, the same complaints that every musician committee has year after year after year. If it was urgent, it would have changed. So until it's urgent to them, it won't change. And I believe that in this society, until it affects their pockets, it's not going to change. Some of these orchestras, like I worked with the LA Phil on like a one-on-one level last year. And that whole week, it was just like refreshing change after refreshing change that literally came down to one thing. They were not cagey about asking, about discussing, about talking, and they were informed about what was happening in the news. They were informed about what was happening in my mainstream life. They didn't ask me the same question about the same artist every time. They wanted to know, okay, so when you record, how much of your work in the studio is going to come into this premiere here in the lobby of Disney Hall? Like, there was a consent. So it's like every time I see that, I'm both invigorated, like, okay, it is possible. But I'm also like, you're late. Like, what have you been doing? And so, as that, again, it's literally what Titus said. Like, we have to be educated enough so that these things are an option. The concert hall is an option. You want to take it? Cool. You don't? Cool. I don't. That could change next week. I don't know. But at the end of the day, if I put enough energy into being offended by its presence, then in some way they've won. My power is about recognizing that I don't need that building. And that extends beyond just the physical. That's fiscally and emotionally. Because a more emotionally healthy group is the group that understands and can recognize the importance of a village, of unification, of an informed village.
Ms. Pilot, what's your response to that? Are there ways in which we can, again, I'll use that word, reform the concert hall, or do Black musicians need to work on dealing with our emotional attachments to those physical and even places, the concert hall?
Well, I personally would be very sorry to see some of these wonderful concert halls being torn down. Um, they have some of the best acoustics and best history. But I think the orchestras are the ones that have to reform their ways of hiring. They need to, be more inclusive of all people, people of color, so that the product that you have on the stage is more reflective of the population as a whole. So I think that that's where the focus should be, as opposed to just tearing down the hall, because once they start hiring Black players, playing more music of Black composers, it would be a shame if there's no place to play all this. So that would be my thought on it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, but before I wrap things up and take care of my closing responsibilities here, I wanted to pass one more question to everyone. The same question. there are a lot of non-Black people. There are a lot of white people watching and listening right now. We talk a lot about, things that we can measure, things that we can actually do, bring in receipts. So, and I'll start with you, Titus. To the white people, to the white person watching this conversation and asking themselves, how can we help? What is your advice to them? How can they help? Acknowledging first, I should say, that the question, in itself sort of speaks back to that servitude, us being told to tell them what to do or fix the problem. So with that part of it acknowledged, with that aside, what is your response to that question? As a white person, what can I do?
I think there's two very specific things that can be done. Demand that your local orchestra has, that demand that the hiring practices are there to ensure that there are corrective action that hires Black players that are there, and also the cultural institution have repertoire that's reflected, that there are instruments and things being played in schools that have Black children that's there. Hold your dollars until those measurements are actually done there as an ally. Hold your money from your symphony until those demands are met, within your local symphony. I mean, I agree with Ms. Potter that, a lot of these, I don't have a problem with the hall itself. I mean, the hall you can record a lot of really cool stuff in the halls, but it depends on the personnel and how we're functioning in this hall. A vessel is nothing without the people who use it. It's an inanimate building that just sits there, and I understand what it represents, but, for a lot of people, but I do think that you should hold your money until those measurements are done. Also, give to places like Gateways. The way that you play us to your symphony, play us to places like Gateways, where the work has already been done. Share their local instrument and things that heavily affect Black children, and give to those things as well. I mean, as we know, within this country, the majority of the wealth is held within the white community. So a way that you can help and be an ally, be with and also inform yourself. Put your dollars there and also inform yourself, which anchors your conviction to be stronger. So it's not just an emotional reaction to what I'm saying, but you have an historical anchoring and vision of where I'm coming from. You live in that world. You read these books. Where do we go from here? I mean, there's a new book even about how do you do reparations and economic reform for Black people by Dr. Sandy Darity. I mean, look up things like that you can really find out very deep, detailed things that can economically impact Black communities and where you are, because this has historical anchoring to it while we're in the position that we're in. So demand those things, put your dollars where that is, and support places like Gateways and local institutions that you have, and demand your orchestra to be different.
Yeah, Jess, I guess I'll remix the question a little bit for you, considering some of your past experiences. I remember at one point watching the documentary on Beyonce's Homecoming. There's a part in which a guy on the bus yells, "Scream if you went to an HBCU," or something along those lines. Unfortunately, so many of us, we did not. We did not go to HBCUs. What are your words to the HBCU or non-classical Black musicians who need a reason to even care what we're talking about here?
It's twofold. The first thing is Black people challenge your HBCUs and ask them why there's no string program. When I was graduating from high school, all I wanted to do was go to an HBCU. I really had no interest in attending a conservatory. I had no interest in a state school. I wanted to be on a different world. I wanted that experience. I wanted that, but with violin. That's it. And it is insane that to this day we still have no representation on an orchestric level really that option doesn't exist. Again, it comes down to options. That option should exist. And that was very frustrating. That's something that, as a band, the string section, we lived that. We had to get past that in order to get to the part where we could perform. I had to really get used to that, feeling left out and feeling the way Beyonce did when she was like, I didn't get to experience that. I didn't get to experience the sororities and fraternities. And for me, I'm from the South. Like, my grandmother lived across the street from a Black high school that was very famous for their marching band. So I grew up watching that up and down the street, all I wanted to do was be a West Charlotte Lionette, and I played the violin. So it's like, you know, I think that demand access. And for white people who are watching this, you want to help us, you go to these HBCUs and be like, where can I put my money? How can I put my money? Go to these orchestras and demand. You guys will demand equal pay. You'll demand justice for the 1%. You'll sit on Wall Street. You'll camp out. I had colleagues camping. I remember this vividly in New York. Like talking to colleagues who were camping out and broadcasting about camping out against the 1% for days and days and days and days and days. Why aren't you stalking these orchestras? Why aren't you blowing up the board? Why have you not made cold calls to board members who you know are not online? Pick up the phone. Be better than what this generation says you have to be, and actually like take that extra step and advocate for us. A lot of my fatigue is from the insane process of seeing behavior and expecting something different, you know. So yeah, I agree with Titus. I feel like everything is valid. Just know that you have a choice. And for white people, really, I just need more. Do more. Just do it. Just run these people to the ground. Blow up their Twitter. There's an account online on Instagram called Orchestra is Racist, which is a wonderful account because it's where people can go and share their stories. But my difficulty is that for so many of us, there was no anonymous choice for this. And within that practice of that account, I noticed that anytime I was public about my experiences, or I had colleagues who were also public about their experiences because they put names on it, that account then ignored those stories, which is like so backwards and so meta. And why I'm like, we have to really understand that it's going to take more. It's going to take more than that. So in the same way that we're telling our younger generation to stay educated, we're asking so much of each other. And we're quite honestly asking more of this generation than we were asked to do for this. Then we also, that has to still be less than what white people do who care at this point. Everything we're saying about all the stuff we had to do, that needs to be the minimum for y'all. Because until then, there's really no point in me investing any hope or energy and time into anything that's not actively moving in the other direction.
Yeah. Well, just for what it's worth, I joined the band to be a majorette too, but they handed me a bassoon, so it is what it is, I suppose. Miss Pilot, we have a couple more minutes. I wonder what your words are to our generation and the generations even younger than us. You know, you have done your time. You have served, classical music. What do you have to say to us traversing this field and even the people beginning that journey?
Well, I think you have to want it. Like Jess said, she doesn't really want it that much anymore. You have to want it because there are certainly difficulties, and so it is it's a choice, and there's going to be a lot of things that you can't control because an orchestra is certainly not, as we've been saying, it's not people friendly. Really, it's not. The union doesn't control it. It's the management, the conductors, and all of that. So if you can deal with all of that and you love playing an orchestra, as I did, as Titus said he did, then I think it's worth it. It's worth the work that you need to put in, and it's worth the experience. But once you get inside, if you can do what I was not able to do really, which was to try to get more Black composers, try to get more Black players in the orchestra, then it would make the experience more rewarding for you and for everyone, I think. And this weather here is going crazy. Can you see that back? The hurricane.
I see it. It's coming in.
Stay safe
out there.
Well, before you blow away, Ms. Pilot, Jess, Titus, thank you so much for being here. I've been given the
Can I,
very grand honor of concluding today's presentation by presenting an award, the Gateway's Music Festival Trailblazer Award. You know, sometimes we use that phrase trailblazer and don't really know what we're saying. It's easy to overlook the power behind being a trailblazer. Oxford defines it as an innovator, a pioneer, or a person who makes a new track through a wild country. That's a very important phrase there from Oxford, a wild country. I know that so many of us like to think of classical music and classical music spaces as safe haven, somewhere that isn't so wild as that definition said. But from the stories that we've all heard from the elders and even many of our contemporaries, the concert hall can be wild, a very wild and unsafe place for many Black musicians. When Miss Ann Hobson Pilot started studying the harp back in the 1950s, much of the world was wild. Places down south and elsewhere that were segregated by law and that were under the scourge of state-sanctioned white supremacy. It's been documented now, thanks to the internet and social media, that even our very homes don't always keep us safe from police brutality and America's racism. So as you can imagine, Miss Hobson Pilot faced many challenges along the way in classical music, one of the whitest spaces, traditionally speaking, but those challenges were no match for her. After studying at the Maine Harp Colony, the Philadelphia Musical Academy, and ultimately the Cleveland Institute of Music, Ann Hobson Pilot was selected to play as master harpist in the Nashville Symphony Orchestra in 1966, becoming its first Black member and among the first class of Black musicians accepted into American orchestras nationwide. She later joined the Pittsburgh Symphony and ultimately the Boston Symphony Orchestra, becoming the group's principal harpist in 1980. She's been retired from that post since 2009, and the trail that she blazed through that wild, unexplored wilderness of classical music has proven to impact not only other Black musicians, but the entire world of orchestral music. I'll include a personal note here. When I first got into radio, Ms. Hobson Pilot's recordings were always among the very first that I went to. My listeners down in Knoxville know your sound and your incredible technique very well, as I said earlier. It's my hope that with this Gateway's Trailblazer Award, your legacy can be even further enshrined in legend and highlighted as one of the moments in which Black folk really made headway in this field that we've all grown to love. I wish I could hand this award to you in person, Ms. Pilot, or even from a safe physical distance, but it will be mailed to you from the headquarters of the Gateway's Music Festival. Ann Hobson Pilot, on behalf of Lee Kuntz, the Gateway's Festival Orchestra, and the entire Gateway's Music Festival, I'd like to present you with the 2020 Trailblazer Award. Thank you so much for everything you've done for us.
Thank
And
you.
that concludes, yes. And that concludes today's presentation. Thanks again to Ann Hobson Pilot, Lady Jess, and Titus Underwood for joining me here. I hope you'll all come back at 7 o'clock, 7 Eastern, for a pre-concert conversation, followed by a very special recital featuring cellist Tapelo Masita. He'll have some Bach for you alongside some Afro-American and South African music. Until then, I hope that everyone will find their peace. Again, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. It's been my pleasure. I'll see you back on the airwaves. Gateways Radio starts at 10:30 a.m. Eastern tomorrow morning. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.